I caught up earlier today with Liberal Senator for South Australia, Alex Antic. Senator Alex Antic, thanks for joining us. I'll come to this issue about the cricketers and their protest in a moment. But first up, as a Liberal senator in South Australia, do you fully support what the state premier has done there? There are businesses shut down, there are people being stood down and forced to take annual leave from their places of employment. People are banned from travelling around the country from South Australia, all because of one localised outbreak of about 20 people.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Look, I think what we're seeing is, I think, sadly going to be the tip of the iceberg in some of these cases. There were 3 overnight, but, you know, a sort of a precursory glance at what we're describing here would tend to suggest that this could get much worse before it gets better. So I think these steps are unfortunately needed at this time. We're not seeing us necessarily jumping back under the doona, I wouldn't have thought, but there need to be some sensible restrictions placed on. I mean, we need to, at least for a short period of time, take some steps to make sure that the outbreak doesn't bulge out upon the seams and end up like Victoria. I mean, we saw, I think Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales take some pretty reasonable steps, and I think, unfortunately, this is just a necessity of where we're up to. Nobody likes it, but I don't really see any other choice, and I think we've got a pretty good track record in this state at contact tracing, and SA Health have done a great job. So let's wait and see, but I hope I'm wrong about that, but I have a feeling there may be more to come.
The problem here, though, is such blunt instruments to deal with something that should be done through contact tracing. You've got businesses shut down all over the state, if they happen to be gyms and the like. You've got hotels and restaurants forcing people to take annual leave now. You've got South Australians can't travel interstate. This is just unsustainable. How can we contemplate as a nation, let alone as a state, doing this sort of thing when there's a small cluster of about 20 people infected?
Well, I think we're holding the fort a little bit at this stage. I mean, you said quite rightly that the restrictions on gyms are for a 2-week period, and I think other businesses are the same, and we've seen reductions in numbers in certain businesses. Look, I don't think any of this is ever going to be perfect, but at this stage, given the great work that we've done so far during the course of this pandemic, I think, unfortunately, we just have to press on with these measures. And look, I'm hopeful that it won't be as bad as suggested, but at this stage, I just think we need to be as cautious as we can. We're seeing huge lineups. People are doing the right thing. They're getting tested in huge numbers, in the thousands today. So I think we'll know more in 48 hours, and I'd expect that the Liberal government in South Australia would be able to pivot pretty quickly if things turn out to be better than expected.
What about the culpability of that government? At the moment, on the border of South Australia and Victoria, there are people who have to go across the border every day to take their kids to school in South Australia. They have to have a COVID test every week, mandatory testing for them every week. Yet the cleaners in the quarantine hotels, who have daily been cleaning the bathrooms and the toilets of people returning from overseas, they were not tested up until this week.
Yeah, look, I think to a certain degree, some localised outbreaks are always going to happen. I mean, you might almost suggest that it's surprising that it hasn't happened already, which is a great testament to the system that's already been placed. Look, I don't think any of these things are ever going to be perfect. There's never a perfect way to deal with this. It's really about how you manage them. And I think there's no other alternative but to be very cautious at this stage, and hopefully things will fall into line sooner rather than later.
OK, the reason we got you on was to talk about the cricketers, the Australian cricketers taking a Black Lives Matter protest, if you like, a barefoot protest at the start of this summer's one-day cricket season. You don't support this protest? In fact, you'd like to see them not partake?
Well, I think the danger with some of this stuff is that it's almost the danger of the unknown. What we've seen is sort of a positive affirmation that the cricketers and presumably Cricket Australia will get involved and support this organisation. And I think Pat Cummins said that the more you learn about this movement, the more it becomes a no-brainer, or words to that effect. But the truth is, the more you learn about the organisation BLM, the more you should be running away in the opposite direction. I mean, this is an organisation that has its roots in radical neo-Marxist thought. Until very recently, on their website, they had their what we believe in manifesto, if you like, and it contained such gems as disrupting the Western nuclear family and things of this nature. Now, I think the difficulty here is that the language that's used by some of these leftist organisations is very clever, because, as we've spoken about at length, in the last 6 months, the concept and the affirmation that Black Lives Matter is of course, a very real one. But the truth of the matter is you need to dig deeper. And these are the sorts of things that kids who are watching their heroes play are getting sort of forced down their throat by decisions like this. And I'm not a fan of that. In fact, I'm not a fan of sport and politics sharing the same room. They've heard it said that in the court of public opinion there should be a restraining order between sport and politics. They need to be 500 metres apart at all time. People play sport and watch sport to unify and as a form of escapism more than anything. And I don't think this is helpful, and I don't think that it's warranted, quite frankly.
Look, I think your point about the organisation Black Lives Matter is a strong one. There's a lot of radical leftist agenda involved in that, a lot of radical anarchists as well. Perhaps so that's what the cricketers are trying to avoid. Instead of taking the knee, going for this barefoot protest, more of a nod to our Indigenous compatriots.
Yeah, which is all fine, of course, but the reality is they are endorsing BLM. And, I think this is a sort of a strange cultural shift over the last probably 5 to 10 years where sport and politics, sport and Hollywood, Hollywood and politics have all become, sort of unanimous. And I think it's time that people started voting with their feet, telling Cricket Australia and, the AFL and other organisations that they just want to be entertained. The reality is that people don't want to get their escapism and have politics forced down their throat. I think it's time the Australian people spoke about this. It's probably time the Australian people released the Kraken on politics and sport joining to the hip.
Yeah, I think the other point is that it is virtue signalling. It doesn't do anything concrete to help people disadvantaged in this community, and that was something picked up by our friend and the Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs, Jacinta Price, on Paul Murray last night. Have a listen.
The woke brown person says jump, and everyone's got to say, okay, how high? What is this going to do for Aboriginal people? Absolutely zero. I'll tell you what it'll do for the cricketers, though. Make them look utterly ridiculous as they stand there pretending to be woke and all virtuous, but knowing deep inside that they too are probably dying slightly and cringing themselves.
Really strong opinion there from a leading Indigenous voice. Of course, there are other Indigenous activists supporting this move. But I think, Senator Antic, one of the issues here is, do you think that the cricketers and various sporting organisations have their hand forced? They actually have to bow to these sorts of pressure groups. Otherwise, they'll be the victims of social media campaigns and worse to shame them into taking some sort of action.
Well, look, it's a very good point you make, and I don't know. I don't know the insides and outs of what's actually taken place here, but certainly across the board we are seeing pressure on sporting organisations, on corporations to adopt this line, and I think it's very foolish. I mean, we saw what happened a while back with Gillette and their toxic masculinity campaign. It ended up costing them billions. And we're now seeing reports that the NFL in the US is down 20% of its viewership since 2016. ESPN's down almost 2 million subscribers a year, it would seem. And even the NBA last year apparently had the lowest ratings in its final season that it's had for a while. This is the fate that awaits corporations and sporting organisations that get woke. They go broke.
There we go, Alex Antic, the Liberal Senator for South Australia. You might hear a bit more about him in the months and years to come.